So Sarla, are you able to get around now, or you're working from home mostly?
No, no, we've been open. We've been open for quite some time.
I guess it's 7:30. Sarala, please do the honors.
Yes.
I'll ask
Uh,
Sarala to introduce.
yes. Good evening, everybody. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for coming and welcome to every one of you who've joined us. I can see there are people from Nepal also, so a very warm welcome to every one of you. Uh, this is again our the Birdwatcher Society's season 1, number 6, series number 6 webinar. And today we are going to hear from Dr. Ghazala Shahabuddin about woodpeckers of the Western Himalaya. What are they telling us and why we should listen? This is being organized by Birdwatcher Society, which is a not-for-profit organization based out of Kolkata. And basically it comprises of ardent and passionate bird watchers who not only watch birds, but also they do a lot of advocacy about conservation and um, data management and also conserving bird habitats. Today, I'm really happy to have Dr. Ghazala with us for taking out time to be part of this and speak about her experience and this very interesting topic on woodpeckers. Uh, so before I introduce you all a little bit in details to Ghazala, just some house rules. So if you want to ask questions, the chat box is there. So you can all type in your questions in the chat box. And please mute your microphones so that, you know, when the speaker is speaking, it doesn't disturb her with any background noise that you may have. With that, I would want to introduce you to Ghazala. She's an ecologist who started out as an avid bird watcher and an environmental campaigner with Kalp Vriksh in Delhi in the 1980s. She specializes in studying the effects of land use change on bird and butterfly communities in multiple use landscapes, such as the Palni Hills, Western Ghats, Delhi Ridge, Sariska, Corbett, and Kumaon. As a university professor and trainer, she has mentored numerous young people, instilling a love for bird research and conservation. Since 2014, she has been affiliated with Center for Ecology, Development and Research, researching faunal ecology of the Western Himalayas, and she is currently involved in a nature guide training program for rural youth in Uttarakhand. So in this talk today, she will describe her personal journey getting to know the intriguing woodpecker group, about which she and her team have uncovered many interesting details since 2003. The aim is to understand more about the little known and vulnerable woodpecker species, many of whom are good indicators of forest quality, from the large gray slaty woodpecker to the brown fronted pied woodpecker. What do woodpeckers signify about their forest habitats and landscapes, and what do their distribution patterns portend for the future? So this is going to be a very, very interesting topic, and I hope all of you enjoy and learn more about woodpeckers. With this, over to you, Ghazala.
Sure. Thanks, Sarla and Sujan for organizing this, and the Birdwatcher Society for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to talk to people from a different part of the country than I'm used to. So it's nice to see people from Eastern India and Nepal and all these places. So today I want to talk, it's kind of a synthetic talk, drawing on a few different experiences with woodpeckers across the northern, the Himalayan area. And what I and my team have been kind of trying to do with all of the, the passion and the fun that this involves. As all of you know, woodpeckers are one of the most colorful and interesting species that almost everybody notices. But it's interesting how little we actually know about them. So before I start, I'd like to introduce my research team that have really been instrumental in helping me do all of this. And of course, a lot of it is part of their PhD and master's work and so on. On the left, you see Tarun Menon, who's been working with me for the last 2 years and now going on to do a PhD. Then there's Raman Kumar, an old friend and a person with whom I did some work, and he got his PhD through that, but we worked together for a while in Seriska and in CORBETT Park. And then in a long distance survey of the great slaty woodpecker. Ritu Broto has been an intern through several seasons and now is just done his master's. And then there's Raj Kamal, who's now with ATRI, who did his postdoc work with us. So it's because of all of these people that we have so much and consistent data over several seasons. They've worked in the cold and the heat, and sometimes the weather can be quite harsh in the Himalayas, but everyone has been working hard through the seasons. So I just want to start by asking, what exactly is a forest? So when we go out and watch birds, we often just focus on the fact that, oh, we are seeing this bird and this is really rare and this is something that everyone wants to see. I remember when I was in Singapore and the last pair of great slaty woodpeckers came to Singapore across from the Malay Peninsula. There were 100 people going and looking at the great slaty woodpeckers. But people didn't realize what is the population status, what is the reason for these woodpeckers getting very rare. So we have to come back to really trying to understand what is a forest ecosystem and what do we call a forest. And I think this has become more relevant in recent times when our government and previous government before that have tried to, constrain the meaning of a forest, And as far as I'm concerned, as a biologist, an ecosystem is really, something that supports the entire diversity of flora and fauna in that system, and a place where all of the ecological and evolutionary functions are carried out and are performed. By ecological functions, I mean, things like seed dispersal, pollination, food webs, complicated food webs occur in ecosystems, many of which are getting disrupted because of lack of, key species. Apart from all of the, the biological function, there's also human utility. Many of the things that we depend on really depend on healthy ecosystems. So a lot of my time has really been spent thinking about how our forests are used and to what extent they are really forests now in the sense of functioning, living, breathing ecosystems. And in that context, I want to point out that most of our forests in India today or in many other countries are actually used for something or the other. There was an estimate in Science recently that almost 75% of our forests are used by people, either for some heavy duty extraction or from long-term extraction or conversion into plantations, and used for commercial purposes. Now, as you can see, if you look at these pictures, there's a whole range of, shapes and vegetative structures that change when forests are converted, modified. On the left, you see a healthy oak forest with its full canopy. None of the trees have been chopped. You can't see the understory, but there's nothing going on in the understory. In the middle, you see an extracted forest with compacted soil, lopped trees, none of which are allowed to reach their full size. And on the right side, we see, a plantation, a pine plantation, where it's a monoculture. So these are all, in policy terms, these are all called forest. And that is something I want you to keep in mind as we go through this slideshow. Specifically, how use of any kind affects forests is the first thing that happens is the canopy cover declines. So from thick shade, you get a very open area. On the left, you see a dense forest. On the right, you see a used forest, intensively used forest. You get much more light in the understory because of the canopy cover. Many fewer species. So from a healthy forest with a lot of different species, you end up with one or two species that are very tolerant to use and grazing and so on. You also end up with trees that are smaller in stature, smaller in girth, and very few shrubs and understory. Of course, I'm looking at an extreme example here. There are all shades of degradation. And what is important to note here is that all of this affects fauna in some way. And ever since I started working on birds professionally, for a long time I was a bird watcher, and then I decided to go and get a PhD. And ever since I started working professionally, I used to wonder about how species react to the kind of changes that we are bringing about in their ecosystem. So, and as far as trying to understand impacts, I and my team members, particularly Raman, when he started doing his PhD, we decided to look at woodpeckers. We felt that woodpeckers are a group that are strongly affected by forest degradation, just visually speaking. They are so dependent on trees. You hardly ever see them on the ground like other species, or you don't see them, feeding on nectar. They're very linked to trees, and a lot of them are linked to big trees. They're also mostly resident with very few, very, very scanty seasonal movements. So, they tend to show the status of the habitat much more than migratory species. They're also conspicuous and identifiable. So, as I said earlier, they're one of the most popular groups, and almost any amateur bird watcher can actually start identifying species. And then, as many of you bird watchers would know, they are cavity makers, and because of that, they're said to have a keystone role in the ecosystem. They make cavities, and these cavities are used by a whole range of other groups of species. So you have a lot of nuthatches, you have owlets, you have miners, you have flycatchers, and of course hornbills. And then apart from that, a whole bunch of reptiles, mammals, and so on also use holes. So, and holes are something that are not easy to make. It's only the woodpecker with its very strong bill and its adaptations for, for making cavities that really can, make cavities. And all of these other species are so dependent for reproduction on these cavities. So if we lose woodpeckers from habitats, it's likely that we are going to lose several other species, at least temporarily or in the long term. So here you see, if you look at this schematic, the black diagram, black circle indicates a woodpecker, and there are all of these other species, the purple species, which are all dependent on the woodpecker through the food web. The woodpecker itself may be dependent on these two orange circles. I'm not naming these species, just a schematic. So if you can imagine, if the woodpecker disappears, what happens to all of these? You get a highly simplified system. So because of these reasons, we decided that woodpeckers are a very useful group to study, apart from the fact that when we started out studying woodpeckers, there were very few publications from India. The veteran Dr. Shantaram, of course, had worked. And after that, there had been no work in India at all focusing on woodpeckers. So I want to take you through 3 case studies quickly, just to give you a flavor for what is being found out and what more is waiting to be discovered. The first study was that I was involved with was CORBETT Tiger Reserve. Here, Raman got his PhD and he did, was 90% of the work. But I tried to get there as often as I could. I was supposed to be his supervisor. As you know, CORBETT Tiger Reserve is a sal area. It has very rich sal forests, which are mature. There has been no logging in this system or most of this system for at least 70 years. However, in the past, in the buffer zone, there are areas that have been worked, and they were worked until 1996, at least, if I'm not mistaken. So on the left side here, you see the worked sal forest. You can see how the trees are of a uniform age, and there's hardly any young generation here. It's all the older trees. Then you have natural forest, and then you have the teak plantations. During British time, a lot of teak plantations were uh, started in this area. This area is highly unsuitable for teak, however. So the teak plantations are not very healthy. But because of the fact of having this range of systems and the natural protected forest right adjacent to these systems, which was in the core area of the reserve, it's made a very good setup for looking at the impact on woodpeckers. So just a couple of results. Raman got his PhD in 2011, and he has published a lot of this already. Those of you who are interested can see the papers. Just want to point out a couple of results that were really interesting. One is to see how the woodpecker densities just drop from protected forest towards, if you go towards managed forest and then to teak plantations. So here you see a simple graph showing woodpecker density per square kilometer on the y-axis and 4 different habitats on the x-axis. And the green squares, the dark squares show the numbers in the breeding season, and the red squares show the numbers in the non-breeding season, which is winter. And you can see how in the breeding season, the numbers in all of the managed forests and the teak plantations are about 1/4 of what you find in the natural forest. And then the interesting part is in the winter, the woodpeckers tend to spread out, possibly because they are relieved from the constraints of breeding and looking after young ones and territoriality. And they occur in mixed flocks in the winter. And then you see how the numbers, the differences between the natural sal and the managed sal sort of narrows down in winter. And you can see that teak plantations have hardly anything. I mean, this is all data over 4 different seasons, 2 summers and 2 winters. And so the numbers are very reliable. So that's one thing, that numbers drop drastically. The other work that we did was looking at these species, at this result species-wise. And what we found is that the larger the species, the more likely it was to be affected by the habitat modification. So the 3 of the species that were affected most were greater yellownape, the greater goldenback, and the gray-headed woodpecker. I forgot to mention that this area has amongst the largest, most diverse set of woodpeckers, even globally speaking. So a lot of people talk about Borneo as having 17 species, 16 species, but I mean, it's incredible that in CORBETT area, less than 300 kilometers from Delhi, because we have a large expanse of good mature sal, we have 16 species available, and that's one of the reasons Raman decided to work here. So out of these species, about 5 or 6 showed significant impacts of habitat modification. They occurred very infrequently in plantations and managed forest. And here, I'm not showing the great slaty, but it was showing a lot of effect, but the numbers were too few to be analyzed properly. So the next other result that is very intriguing is, so we're finding that larger species tend to drop out from modified habitats and plantations. So if we look at, one of the things that enters your mind is it dependent on the size of the tree? And of course, we analyzed a whole range of vegetation features, looking at the diameter of the foraging tree. One of the things we got a very good result for, where we correlated the bill size, which you see on the x-axis. So you can see that the bill size is a surrogate for the size of the woodpecker. The larger woodpeckers have larger bills. So on the x-axis, you have the bill size of the woodpeckers. And here you have on the y-axis, the average of the GBH, or the size of the tree that they were seen foraging on. So every time a woodpecker was seen on a tree, the size of that tree was measured, and the average of those was taken. That is what you see here in these dots. So for instance, the average for the great slaty woodpecker was about 63 centimeters DBH, which works out to about 190 centimeters GBH, which is the whole girth of the tree. So what is to be noticed here is that as the size goes up, the average size of the foraging tree goes up. So basically, larger woodpeckers are looking for larger trees to forage on. And what could be happening in the modified habitats, I showed you the pictures. There's a lot of vegetation data out there that I'm not showing you. The modified habitats have thinner trees, smaller trees, and therefore cannot support the large woodpeckers. Apart from the fact that there probably is less insect biomass for these woodpeckers to feed on, sufficiently. So this was something that was really very interesting. And so after Raman finished his PhD, we decided to look at great slaty. Now this had been very intriguing. It had been playing hide and seek in CORBETT. Of course, it's a very rare species, so the number of sightings was too few. So we decided to do a large-scale survey in SAL areas to see exactly what was happening with this woodpecker. Is it really scarce throughout its range? What is interesting about this woodpecker is a lot of bird watchers who've been to the Terai possibly look out for this woodpecker. It's the largest woodpecker in the world. And it is a very interesting group living species. It has interesting displays every evening when it settles down to roost. And it's never found far away from sal forests. Could be endangered, but nobody knows enough about the species. And this was something we wanted to work on. So Raman did a lot of legwork here. I joined him for a few days in Rajaji area, where I got to see the woodpecker once in 10 days of tramping through the woods. So in this project, Raman went to 50 forest blocks in Hardwar and Dehradun districts that were sal-bearing forest blocks. He laid a 2-kilometer transect in each block and surveyed those using both visual sightings and call playbacks. And of course, looked out for cavities and measured the trees and all of that, which we have to do every time we do a bird study. So it was really, really backbreaking work. And if I show you the results, it's a bit scary in the sense that the area of sal is really large. In this map, you see the green area as the forest area, which is the sal area. Out of this area, we chose the places where the sal was really mature and where there was a possibility of finding great slaty, not the areas which had been worked recently. So the blue spots you see are all the places where samples were taken, transects were done, and surveys were done. Out of all of these areas, out of the 100 kilometers that were walked, woodpeckers were found in these spots, the places where the red dots are shown. This is where the great slaties were sighted visually. And the yellow spots, circles are the ones where only the cavities were seen, but had a high probability of hosting great slaty. So basically, out of this entire area, out of 50 survey sites, all of which were highly likely based on vegetation, great slaty woodpeckers were detected at only 7 places. So it just shows you that it's extremely scarce. The other things that were found is that it was found most often in places where there were large trees, there were old dead trees, which are known as snags, and large tracts of sal forest. So as you can imagine, a large bird which lives in a flock would require a very large home range. So for a viable population, you need large areas of good forest for the species. Interestingly, the deformed and the insect-infested trees were those that were used for cavities, and they were all above 53 centimeters in girth. which gives you some clues as to why they were so rare in the worked sal forest and the plantations in Corbett. It's because all of the deformed trees and the insect infested trees are taken out during forest working. None of those are left inside. And even after 30 years of abandonment of these plantations, the birds have not come back. So you can imagine how much longer it will take for these large birds to come back. Looking at all of this stuff together, you can surmise that further forest degradation and further forest working and plantations may very well lead to local extinction of this species. And we published all of this work, and they're side by side. Woodpecker expert Martin Lamerting also felt, who worked mostly in Borneo. He has lobbied for the woodpecker to be included in vulnerable species. Earlier it was in non-threatened. It has become a threatened species now. So hopefully we will see more attention. And after all of this that happened in 2011, and we published the work on great slaty woodpeckers in Journal of Bombay Natural History Society as well. And then as a quirk of fate, I ended up in the oak forests of the Himalaya. I used to be teaching at Ambedkar University, and every summer I had to take students out for fieldwork for their internship. And I had a friend who worked in this area, and I said, who's going to tolerate the hot summer of Delhi? Let's go up to the Kumaon. And I ended up in this fascinating landscape, which I later found out is an endemic bird area. And we work mostly in the Banj oak and the Tilonj oak areas up to altitude of about 2,400 meters. This is the hardwood belt. The cheer pine is also existing there, but it's a pioneer species. And in this area, interestingly, we have as many as 8, and now recently another species has been recorded, greater goldenback. So all of these species are recorded in this particular belt, 1,500 meters to 3,000 meters. For some of these, they belong here and only to the Himalaya, like the brown-fronted pied woodpecker and the rufous-bellied occur, purely Himalayan species. Other species such as greater yellow nape are found in other parts of India where there is sal forest, rich mature forest. And there's a whole range of sizes here. And because there were 8 species, we thought it might be a good place to look at woodpeckers. Of course, we've worked on all the birds here. And Tarun, of whom I showed a picture earlier, he has done his master's on the birds of this area. Later, we continued the work to look more in depth at woodpeckers. And for this part of the work, there were several sets of sites. I'll show you some of the results. This is where Tarun decided to work. He took a range of sites ranging from highly protected, dense oak forest all the way to highly lopped. We decided to keep the vegetation constant because then that doesn't give you an extra factor to deal with. You're looking at only one type of vegetation at the same altitude. So climatically and vegetationally, it's all very similar. The degraded forest, which you see on the right, is mostly because of lopping of wood and clearing of leaf litter by local people who are getting a lot of NTFP out of this, non-timber forest produce. So you can see how short the trees are. They're not reaching the full size, and they are more or less evenly aged. So we had a whole range of sites ranging from protected to heavily lopped. So the first result from this, we've got data there from 2 summers and 2 winters. So pretty reliable and a little messy, of course. Ecological data is always messy. But what we were gratified to find is that woodpeckers were showing very similar results to what we were seeing with forest working in the Corbett area. So here you see 3 kinds of habitat along the x-axis: lopped habitat, which means heavily degraded. Degraded habitat generally tends to retain its canopy cover, but has younger trees and very little understory. And then you have highly protected forest, and all of them were equal sized in sample almost. I think there were 1 or 2 anomalies there. And here I'm showing the total number of woodpecker records over 4 seasons. As you can see, the lopped is showing 1/3 of the density of the protected forest. The degraded is showing about 2/3. So definitely similar effects are happening here. What we need to know is actually what are the species that are being affected, which are the vulnerable ones. We found that not all species are affected similarly. Earlier, I forgot to mention that in the teak plantations of CORBETT, the black-rumped flameback was found to be neutral to habitat modification. It was almost as abundant in teak plantations as it was in the forest. And all of us urban bird watchers know that it has adapted really well to the city, and it is still seen in the gardens and residences. So it is a adaptable species. In the oak forest also, we have our set of adaptable species. So looking at the species, out of all of our 8 species, we were able to work on only 2, because again, despite 4 seasons of work, we were able to get enough data only on 5 or 6 species out of the 9 that occur there. So that is one of the pitfalls of working on woodpeckers. You have to be prepared to spend a lot of time in the field. So here I'm showing results of 4 species. Now these are a little confusing, but I'm assuming that a lot of bird watchers actually started out as engineers or accountants or other professions. So they will be able to make out some of these graphs. So here I'm basically what I'm showing is 2 vegetation features on the x-axis. One is canopy cover that I've been talking about incessantly, and how birds respond to that. And here is a mathematical technique that tells you how probable it is that a woodpecker will be found there or not. And as you all know, probability ranges from 0 to 1. So if you see that if we take the rufous-bellied woodpecker, which is in purple, you can see that as canopy cover increases, as you hit 50% of canopy cover, there's a stark increase, a drastic increase in the probability that it will be found in that forest. So out of, if you're looking at 75 sites, as we go towards the better sites with better canopy cover, you have higher and higher probability until you reach a probability of 1 or 98% here. So that's your rufous-bellied. The greater yellow-nape shows the same trend. And the blue here is for the Himalayan woodpecker. It shows a trend which is slight but present. And this is the brown-fronted pied. So no effect at all. Okay, so this is what we are finding. So our equivalent of the black-rumped flameback here, brown-fronted pied, is relatively neutral. It's a small species. You see it a lot in the horticulture areas, in people's gardens and all. It's easy, it's adaptable. Whereas these 2 species will just disappear once you take away the good forest with from them. I won't go into this one too much, but again, the other feature that we found was really important was the proportion of forest, which is a surrogate for fragmentation. So a lower proportion of forest in the landscape indicates that it belongs to a site with high fragmentation. A high proportion indicates that it's part of a large continuum of oak forest, at least a few square kilometers or a few hundred square kilometers. So again, you see that the rufous-bellied shows a slight response, and so does Himalayan. Brown-fronted pied doesn't show a response. Greater yellow-nape doesn't show a response here. It is an anomaly. We would have expected it to show. We think it is partly because there's less data, but it could be adaptable as well. We have not really got enough data on this species. So of the species that intrigued me the most was this rufous-bellied, on which we've done some extra work. And Rito Broto was responsible for collecting data on the woodpecker foraging behavior and on the sap trees of. Now, what is interesting about this woodpecker is it's found only in the Himalayan region. It is endemic to the Himalayan region. Of course, it occurs in Southeast Asia as well. But in India, it is found only in the Himalayas and in a very narrow altitudinal belt. What is different about this is that it's a sapsucker species. It's found in hardwoods. It's evolutionarily distinct. It's not a true woodpecker. It's not the subfamily of woodpeckers, but it is in the same family, Pisidae. And what is intriguing about this species was that it would come back again and again to the same tree, and it was highly territorial. And then we looked around and we found sap trees. Now, this is a tree that the woodpecker actually makes a hole in and drinks up the sap. And as you can see from its bill, it's not that sturdy and tough bill of the other woodpeckers. It's a more pointed bill. And it also has a brush-like tongue to suck up the sap. It's the only sapsucker found in Asia. So I think it's a very special bird. And we managed to get extra data on this. We counted up the surveys where we had done work early on in 2016 onwards, where we looked at a large number of sites, right from protected forest, degraded forest, and other sites. And here we're showing 4 different sets of data, summer of 2016, 2017, and so on. Here I show the number of sites where the woodpecker was recorded out of the number of sites that were surveyed. So here you see that only 10 places out of 69 the woodpecker was recorded. Here 12 out of 60, 13 out of, and so on. And if you divide up the forest sites into degraded and protected, out of the 10 here, 9 were in highly protected sites. Here, out of 12 sites, 10 were protected, 2 sightings were in degraded, and so on. And here we're not talking sightings, we're talking about the number of sites where it was. So if you went to sites again and again, you would see probably the same woodpecker, the individual. So we're counting only the sites where it was actually recorded. And each site was visited at least 4 times. So we are quite confident of our result here. So basically what we're seeing is that this woodpecker, possibly because of its requirement for sap and its requirement for large trees that produce that sap, we have a high preference for protected forest over degraded sites. And all of this, you might ask how we classify it. There's enough, we have published this, so those of you who are interested can read this was published in Folktale. Apart from this, Tarun and Ritubroto also looked at specific features of foraging. For example, if a species was found foraging, the height of the tree was recorded. How high was the tree on which it was foraging? Similarly, GBH was also recorded. Now, what is shown here is a particular calculation that shows you preference versus avoidance of that particular height class. So here you have the height classes of 0 to 1, 2 to 3 meters. And these are the really tall trees here. And this is based on a resource selection index. So basically what you're seeing is that even the small woodpeckers, the medium-sized woodpeckers like Himalayan and brown-fronted pine, are actually preferring taller trees. Here, the anomaly here is because we don't have enough sightings of greater yellow nape. So a 0 generally leads to a avoidance number, but it's not true, as a lot of bird watchers would also testify, usually found high up. Tree DBH, again, the same thing. Lot of older tree classes are preferred by woodpeckers. So basically what we're showing is that these 4 species particularly are showing preference for larger trees for whatever reason. Okay, I'm going to rush through because I'm running out of time. So to summarize, woodpeckers are much more abundant in dense canopied forests with larger and taller trees, and tend to be found more in unfragmented forests. When you look at abundance and richness of woodpeckers, they can be used as indicators of forests with old growth features. By old growth, I mean forests that are protected and not used for a long time, at least 100 years. Degraded forests and plantations do not support the entire native fauna of a particular place, particularly the woodpeckers. And amongst the woodpeckers, the largest species might actually be the most vulnerable. I'm still tempted to go back and show you a very interesting correlation of, so if you think about the fact that woodpeckers are keystone species, they create cavities for a whole large number of other birds and mammals. You also find that a large number of woodpeckers are going for forests that are richer in birds in general. You would expect that if you see more woodpeckers in a particular place, you would also see a larger number of other species. So in a couple of places, both in CORBETT and in the oak forest, we've tested for woodpecker diversity as an indicator. And we found pretty interesting results. This is the result from CORBETT Park, where you see that as you have, as a stand contains more forest and more woodpecker species, you also show a greater number of other bird species. So of course, the mechanics of this is not understood, but I thought this was really interesting to throw out and to study over a larger scale also, if possible. Oak forest also, we've got a significant correlation, but it's not very tight. As you can see, there's a lot of spread in the data. And I apologize to those of you who are not familiar with these kind of graphs, but it's actually very simple, just showing that as you get more woodpeckers, you tend to get more birds as well. Bird community becomes richer. So in some senses, the number of woodpeckers in an area can be thought of as a indicator for the avifauna. So the largest species might be the most vulnerable as well. We've seen how great slaty woodpecker drops out from areas where there are no large trees, even from areas which are, which are relatively good habitat, but extremely rare. We might be in a situation where some of our large woodpeckers might go extinct if we don't stop fragmentation, if we don't stop any more degradation. The ivory-billed woodpecker, which was native to the swamp forests of southern United States, was last seen in 1944. I hope that doesn't happen to our great slaty or our other large woodpeckers. The imperial woodpecker, another group living species, which was a specialist on pine forest, last seen in Mexico in 1956. A lot of people are still getting grants to look for this species, but such a large bird can't be found anymore, so probably extinct. Now, how does this relate to forests? I started out with talking about forests. We have a national target of 33% to be covered under forest. Legally, 23% is forest land owned by the Forest Department. This number is likely to have come down with all of the recent denotifications for various infrastructure forests. But even out of this 23%, only 19% has trees of any kind and any kind of density. Out of this 19%, only 12% has a dense canopy according to their definition. However, because satellite imagery cannot differentiate clearly between plantations and thick orchards and so on, and now that a rule has been made that even if there is a 1 hectare patch, it will be counted as a forest. So even this 12% is likely to not be completely good forest. It's likely to be a smaller number. Apart from this, some analysis of FSI data shows that dense forest is declining and open forest is slowly increasing in certain states. Of course, in some states, things are getting better, but open forest is increasing at the cost of moderately dense and dense forests. So what are we seeing? What does this mean for our bird life? If woodpeckers can be taken as a good indicator, we're likely to reach a situation where we will not have the entire range of species present in our forests anymore. And with our rapid land use change, our fragmentation, infrastructure, tourism, vegetation change happening in any case due to invasive species and climate change, we may end up with ecologically dysfunctional forests. So the keystone species might be lost. We might end up with a much smaller fauna than we started out with. So I want to thank all of our partners and supporters through the years who've been supporting me through all my whims and fancies, looking at woodpeckers and all of our students who are supporting the students working with us. Uttarakhand Van Vibhag has been single-handedly responsible for helping us along, giving us permits and allowing us to stay in remote areas and forest rest houses. CEDAR that has supported me through all this work, NCBS from where students have come and helped out and done their thesis. WWF India funded the Great Slaty survey, which led to some interesting results. And DST has been supporting me through Women Scientist Award, and hopefully will continue to support. So thanks a lot, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghazala, for that very, very interesting presentation. Now, I think the audience can have questions for Ghazala. Please type in the chat box if anybody has questions. I can see one right now. Parul Bhatnagar, she writes, do they use these cavities again for nesting the very next season? So while Ghazala is answering this question, I would request everyone else to, if you have any questions, please type in the chat box. So Ghazala, the first question is, do they use the cavity again for nesting?
Again, yeah. So it's not been observed so carefully. You can imagine how difficult it is to make out whether the same individual is using the same cavities or not. But Raman went on to do some very interesting work on nesting of great slaty, and he had cameras out at great slaty's nests and so on. And what he found was that the great slaties were making new cavities all the time. They were crazy about making cavities. It could partly be because the cavities were constantly under competition by, by usage by other species as well. So at one spot, he found at least 5 other types of birds coming in and occupying those nests that were made. So definitely the woodpeckers are not using them very regularly. It's mostly other species that are using them in the next following year.
Thank you. Ghazala, before I read out the next question, why don't you stop sharing your screen so that...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. A lot of people commenting, very interesting talk and all that. The other question is, how are the Western, Abhijit asks, how are the Western Ghats woodpeckers faring against Himalayan woodpeckers with respect to degradation of forests?
Unfortunately, nobody knows. I don't think the situation is very different in the Western Ghats. Western Ghats is actually much more populated and historically, and has seen a lot of fragmentation earlier. So I don't think the situation is very different. There was a study done on the white-bellied woodpecker, which is the largest woodpecker in the Western Ghats. And this was Shantaram again. He published it recently. And it's very similar. The woodpeckers are going for large patches of mature forest, rainforest. And there are, it really depends on how much degradation is going on. I'm not familiar, but I would guess that the rates of fragmentation and degradation are a little less in the Western Ghats, but not very different.
The next question is from Prakhar. It's great presentation, ma'am. Are there currently any ongoing projects on woodpeckers in India?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, there are people working, but one is not aware because I've not seen anything yet. There are groups working. I think professor from Jammu University is trying to start some work. But it is interesting that apart from Raman, who's continuing to study Great Slaty in great detail, and our work, I'm not aware of other work that is going on. I mean, that's what you see, you know, even such a conspicuous and such a easy to study group is not being studied, and an indicator group. So it's really sad, but I don't think there are too many projects.
The other question is from Kalpataru Haldar, who asks why are woodpeckers considered as keystone species?
Well, because they create these cavities, they are ecosystem engineers. And by creating the cavity, they're creating a completely new niche in the system, which wouldn't be there otherwise. So by creating this niche, you're allowing in for the existence of a whole range of other groups of mammals, birds, and reptiles. So if you lose the woodpecker from that system, you would lose all of these other species. That's why it's called a keystone species.
Dilip Chand asks, I was curious to know, how did we take the measurement of the beaks of woodpeckers? Did we use capturing methods, or data was based upon secondary data?
So it's secondary data. Extremely difficult to catch a woodpecker.
Yeah. Shantam Oja asks, do these species also contribute in seed dispersal, their role in seed dispersal?
Could be. We have seen woodpeckers feeding on fruit in the winter and opportunistically, but not a big role in dispersal.
And there's a question again from Parul, who asks, is the roosting and resting sites, are they different? Other roosting?
Again, nobody knows, but Raman's work reveals that for great slaty, they are different. Roosting sites are different from the nesting sites, but they are nearby.
So Shubhajit asks, what are the other species using nests of woodpeckers? I think you already mentioned that. Mammals, other reptiles and all that.
I can mention for our site, we have specific birds. We have tits, we have flycatchers, we have tree creepers and nuthatches, and we have martins, we have flying squirrels, possibly snakes.
The other question is, what Abhinay Iyer asks, what can we do for birds, woodpeckers and others as common people? How can we help them?
Very interesting. I'm not sure if people have tried putting out nests for woodpeckers, artificial nests. I don't think they would take to it because woodpeckers are very sensitive to the surroundings of their nesting sites. But I think the way we can help is by lobbying very strongly for maintaining our old growth forests, whatever we have left of them. We really need our forests. And it's not just for the birds. We are going to lose our ecological security. You know, if we don't have the entire functioning ecosystem, the hydrological benefits will be lost. The nutrients will be lost. I mean, we are looking at a desert scape if we don't look after all of the birds, not just woodpeckers.
And there's another question from Selvarajan, who asks, any study on pygmy woodpecker?
Nope, not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And the other question is, how would climate change affect Himalayan woodpeckers?
Very interesting. So one is that, for a lot of woodpeckers, as I showed the slide earlier, they do cover a larger altitudinal gradient. So they will be able to move higher up in the system when it gets warmer. But the problem is that the hardwood forests don't travel up the mountain with the same speed that animals can do or birds can do. So what we are looking at is some species adapting to modified habitats and to conifers and so on. A lot of species not being able to survive because there are no more hardwoods at beyond 2,700 meters or 3,000 meters. The other problem that I can see is that, our oak forest, for example, if we take an example, we have its own set, it has its own set of woodpeckers. Now, if you have woodpeckers from lower regions climbing up the mountain because of warming, there's likely to be huge competition for nesting and other resources in the oak forest. And I hope that doesn't happen, but it seems to be a possibility which should be studied.
There's Abhijit who asks, are there any predators for woodpeckers?
There's likely to be predators like for other birds. We have not seen any instances. I would assume that during the nesting stage, there is quite a bit of predation by lizards and snakes and martens, uh, you know, so civet cats and so on. As adults, I think there are fewer predators.
Parul, I think she can get in touch with you because she says she's doing a PhD on breeding aspects of Himalayan woodpecker in Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary. So Parul, I think you can get in touch with.
Very happy to hear that she's working on woodpeckers.
So Leela says she's asking a naive question, and she asks, I think she came in late. So are there some woodpecker species specific to Sal forest? So
Only Sal.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
In India, I think Great Slaty is one that is really specific to Sal. The others are kind of Sal loving, but they also go in and inhabit tall rainforest in eastern India and so on. Very few that are just specific to Sal.
Aditya Pradhan asks, how are piculets different from large woodpeckers in terms of habitat preference?
Yeah, piculets seem to be more adaptable. You do see them in a lot of different habitats. They're more adaptable. They're also smaller, so they're able to forage in smaller territories and in smaller trees. We've seen them in orchards and so on. They're more adaptable.
There's a question from Shubhajit who's asking, is there any species of woodpecker migrating to other countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan?
No, there's no seasonal migration except for some altitudinal migration in woodpeckers. There's no large-scale continental migration.
Or even across countries, you mean?
No, no.
Nidhi Kumari says it was very interesting, and habitat fragmentation leads to change in number of individuals. But can you elaborate on how competition with other species also affects these numbers? If it does affect the number, that is. Does competition basically, yes.
It's an interesting question. So in terms of food resources, woodpeckers depend on, of course, tree gleaning. They move up and down the tree trunk and they eat insects from the bark and so on. And in that sense, they have very few competitors. They might have nuthatches or tree creepers, but that's about it. So, and in terms of cavities, I think they face much more within species competition than across species competition for trees and cavities.
Oh, okay.
There's a very lesser with other species. I don't see any.
So there's a question from a researcher in Nepal, Binay Gimire. He asks, thank you for this very informative presentation. So he says he's conducting research in the mid-hill region of Nepal, in which he has found a greater yellow nape, preferring sal trees with height of 10 to 15 meters and DBH of 14 to 19 centimeters, which is quite different from your findings on DBH part. What do you think is the reason for this anomaly?
I think regionally species do have slight differences in the way they forage and so on, and they do have a bit of adaptation ability. So if they find more forage higher up in a particular place or not, they will adapt accordingly. So I don't think it is extremely different. what we are finding is, I don't remember the numbers, but it's very similar. Uh, you know, and also I mentioned earlier that we don't have enough data on greater yellow nape, so we will probably look for more data in terms of number of sightings.
Som GC again from Nepal asks, has the great slaty always been found nesting in sal trees and not others? I have found them nesting in Terminalia tomentosa tree on a couple of occasions in Nepal.
I think we've also found them on a few other species as well, apart from sal, that are growing in sal forests. Yeah, but mostly on sal.
And there's another question that asks, do the sizes of same species of woodpeckers vary in different regions?
There will be a slight difference based on regional, but very little, very marginal difference. Unless they have been isolated for a very long time and have gone into, evolutionary different, spaces. So they don't vary a lot.
Yeah. So there's another interesting question. So Shantam Oja asks, does the whole lot of holes made by rufous-bellied sapsucker woodpecker affect the trees, its growth rate or height? Is it of any other use to any other animal? In areas of high species richness, how do they segregate their niches?
Lost track of the questions, but one is, the tree, it doesn't seem to have an impact on tree mortality because the holes that they make are quite superficial. They go in only a few inches. So, and after some time, the bark grows outward and, the sap food is not affected. So we've seen trees with a lot of holes that are quite healthy otherwise, have enough leaves and are growing and things like that, doing quite well. And other species, there have been studies in the United States showing that other species depend on the sap that leaks out from these holes. They found hummingbirds and some other tits and so on feeding on the sap. We haven't seen it here, but it's likely to happen. I think it needs more observation. The last question about niche segregation, I didn't quite get what he was trying to ask.
He's saying in areas of very high species richness, how do they segregate their niches?
Oh, okay. All species, right?
Yes. Yes.
This is a very interesting question because we've just published a third paper on the niche organization of birds in CORBETT. There is some segregation based on the kind of tree branch. So the smaller species tend to feed on the smaller secondary branches and the branchlets, whereas the larger species need the tree trunk mainly. There's also, in terms of tree girth, the smaller species can do with smaller trees. There is some level of segregation. I myself don't remember the results because it was far long ago, but I can send some information later on this. There's some degree of segregation and some degree of redundancy as well.
So Prakhar again asks, how have black-rumped flameback managed to adapt to urban areas so well? And is it possible for other species to adapt as well with appropriate plantation in cities?
For other woodpecker species, is it?
Yes.
So the first question is interesting and it needs to be worked on. Nobody really knows how, because nobody has really looked at how black trump flameback is nesting, what are its feeding habits. One of the things I feel about black rump is that it's much more opportunistic about feeding than other woodpeckers, possibly. I've seen it feeding on all sorts of fruit and all. It may not be so dependent on insects like other woodpeckers. You can see it in relatively well-wooded areas, but I have not seen it nesting. So I don't know, needs to be studied. I'm sure that a lot of species will be able to adapt, but depends on what you mean by appropriate plantations. So you can, I mean, the best possible plantations are those where you try to recreate the natural forest of that area. So for instance, if you're doing a plantation in Delhi, it would be nice to do shrubs and herbs and, scrub forest and, the taller trees of the dry deciduous forest. So try to recreate that habitat so the native species can come back. And you can see that happening in Delhi. Many of the areas which are doing well in terms of greenery have come back with woodpeckers.
Okay, there's Neelu Sharma from the J&K Pollution Control Board. So she says, Ghazala, interesting talk. And like many of us are realizing, not many researchers have worked on woodpeckers. I think your group is one which has worked extensively. There's another question. Is there any affinity between nesting tree species and any woodpecker species? Affinity between nesting
trees. Okay.
Yeah. And
Not that I'm aware of. This needs again much more work on nesting, which has not happened.
yes. Shubhajit again asks how monoculture is affecting woodpeckers. I mean, rubber trees, invasive trees like eucalyptus and palm oil plantations. I don't think there's much work done on these, no?
Yeah. Well, there has been a lot of work on birds inside various kinds of monocultural plantations. And what we are finding is that there is a lot of effect on specialized species like woodpeckers. They're definitely affected. You'll find that one or two species or a few species will adapt, but the majority of species will decline in these monocultural plantations.
There's an interesting question from Deepak Gujar who asks, woodpecker brain design has been used in Formula One racing cars to absorb shocks. Do all woodpeckers have such shock absorbing capabilities?
Yes, they do, in fact. They have a lot of different anatomical features that help them absorb the shock of pecking into trees with very high speeds, which would otherwise, destroy their brain. So they have a good brain cavity with very strong bones, and they have a shock absorber, things like that.
And I think one last question. Do woodpeckers, Shubhajit again asks, do woodpeckers use the same nest for laying eggs every year if the tree remains? I think this question came.
Yeah, question was asked. The brief answer is that we don't know, but from the evidence that we have so far, it seems that they create new cavities every nesting season. Because nests also tend to sort of degrade over time, right? Fungus comes in and they need, they get a little worn out and broken. They get, a lot of mud collects inside when the wood decomposes. So they tend to create new nests every year.
Okay, so I think that's it. And thank you, Ghazala. Actually, very, very interesting. I learned a lot about woodpeckers. I can see that, there's so little work. And I wonder how it would be in Northeast, because I haven't heard of any group working in Northeast India on woodpeckers. But hopefully, if there are people from eastern part of the country or Northeast India, I hope there will be people who will be interested to work on this very, very interesting species, particularly because it's such an indicator species, a keystone species. So I hope there will be, many more work and surveys and, research on, and even the bird watchers who are doing, who are there. You all are the most important citizen science people, and it is upon your work, your information that, researchers actually can go and select their sites, because you will already have done one large part of the legwork. And with platforms like eBird and all, so people can actually go in and look and, and it's not like you have to begin from scratch, because people like y'all visit most of these sites. So work is already done. So you all also have a very, very important role to give us more information and to contribute to the scarce information that this group of birds has. So with that, thank you very much. And thank you everyone in the audience for taking out time and coming and listening to this talk. And especially for all the interactions. Very, very interesting questions. It was like a marathon of questions for Ghazala. So thank you very much, everyone. And please do look out for interesting talks that Birdwatcher Society will continue to have in the coming weeks, months. And thank you very much, Ghazala. Thank you very much for the talk.
Sure.
Very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
you.
Everyone,
Good
do
night.
stay safe.
Stay safe.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.